The record spins slowly under the dim light, and somewhere between the crackle and the groove, a voice begins to rise. Not the kind of voice you'd hear on every radio station, but one that feels like a quiet confession meant only for you. It came from Memphis, a city that taught the world how to feel through sound. He never chased fame, yet his songs became the soundtrack to countless nights of love, loss, and longing. Some call him forgotten, others call him timeless, but once you've heard him, you never forget. This is the story of Randy Brown, a man whose voice still lingers long after the applause faded. Let's get into his story right now. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before the neon lights and stage microphones, there was the sound of a small church in Memphis, where a young boy sang his heart out. His name was Randy Brown, born on the 31st of December 1952, right on the edge of a new year, as if life was already promising him a rhythm of beginnings and endings. Memphis wasn't just a city, it was a living pulse. Every street corner hummed with blues, gospel, and soul. The air itself seemed to vibrate with music. In that world, Randy didn't have to look far to find inspiration. From the church pews to the neighborhood jukebox, music surrounded him like air. He once said in an interview that it wasn't fame he wanted, it was feeling. To him, music was not about being heard, it was about being understood. His childhood was modest, shaped by the Southern traditions of community and faith. People in Memphis lived close to their churches and even closer to their radios. Sunday mornings meant hymns that shook the walls, and Saturday nights meant rhythm and blues that spoke to the heart. Randy carried both inside him, the sacred and the sensual, the prayer and the plea. By his teenage years, he was already singing in local gospel groups. That's where his voice began to take shape, strong yet tender, soulful but never showy. His gift wasn't in power alone, but in restraint, the kind that made people listen closer. In those early performances, he learned what all great singers know, that silence can be as powerful as sound. Memphis in that era was a cradle for voices like his. The city had already birthed legends Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, and Al Green, and its heartbeat could be felt in every small recording studio, every basement band rehearsal, every local bar where music was both a dream and a job. Randy was part of that world, quietly watching, learning, absorbing. In the early years of his career, he joined a local group called The Newcomers. They were young men with big dreams, rehearsing in garages and cutting demos whenever studio time was available. The group eventually caught the attention of Stax Records, one of the most iconic labels in American soul music. Signing with Stax was like touching history. It was the label that had launched Otis Redding and Isaac Hayes, and the same hallways that echoed with their voices now heard Randy's. Under Stax, the Newcomers recorded tracks that reflected the Memphis sound, raw, emotional, and unfiltered. Songs like Pin the Tail on the Donkey showed Randy's natural ability to blend rhythm with tenderness. His tone had that rare duality, masculine yet vulnerable, confident yet pleading. Listeners felt as though he was singing directly to them, not at them. But as fate often works, the golden days of Stax began to fade. Financial troubles and industry changes in the mid-1970 led to the label's collapse. For many young artists, that could have been the end. But Randy wasn't built for giving up. That chapter closed, but he was already writing the next one. He spent his late 20s honing his craft, performing in small clubs and recording demos with friends who still believed in soul the way it used to be, live, real, and imperfect. Those nights were his second education. Every smoky room and every slow dance taught him something about human connection. He realized that the power of a song isn't in how many people hear it, but in how deeply one person feels it. It was during this period that Randy developed what would become his signature style, Southern elegance. He carried the warmth of gospel and the honesty of blues, wrapped in the sophistication of soul. People who heard him live said he sang like someone remembering something, a sound both nostalgic and new at once. Randy's beginnings weren't marked by glamour, but by grit. He didn't have a famous mentor or a big break on television. What he had was a community, a city, and a belief that soul music was still the truest form of truth. In Memphis, that belief was enough. By the mid-1970, Randy stood at a crossroads, a man shaped by the church, seasoned by the streets, and ready to step into his own light. He had learned from the best, but he was ready to sing his own story. His journey from those humble beginnings to a solo career would prove one thing. Even in a world full of noise, a quiet voice can still be unforgettable. By the time the lights at Stax went dark, Randy Brown had already found his own direction. The end of one era didn't mean silence, it simply meant transformation. Many who had worked under the Stax banner scattered across the South, trying to rebuild what the industry had taken away. But Randy carried something you couldn't lose: a voice that still believed in emotion over perfection. In the years that followed, he became a familiar name in Memphis clubs, the kind of artist who could walk into a small venue and make the whole room fall still. There was something magnetic about the way he sang. He didn't perform to impress, he performed to connect. Listeners described his shows as intimate sermons for the broken-hearted. The mid-1970s were not easy for soul singers. The sound of America was changing, disco ruled the charts, and record labels chased glitter more than grit. Yet Randy refused to bend his voice to what was popular. He sang the same way he always had, from the inside out. People said you could hear the truth in his tone, even when the crowd was small. Opportunity finally came in 1977 when he signed with Parachute Records, a new label that believed in keeping soul alive during a time when the genre was being pushed aside. For Randy, it wasn't just a contract, it was a second chance. He poured everything he had into his first solo album, Welcome to My Room. The title itself felt symbolic, an invitation, not a performance. When the album was released, it didn't make a loud debut. There were no billboards, no flashy tours. But for those who heard it, it felt like a rediscovery of something pure. Songs like I'm Always in the Mood and I Want to Make Love to You captured a kind of vulnerability that few dared to show. Randy's delivery was calm, intimate, almost as if the microphone was a confidant rather than an audience. Critics who paid attention called it grown folks music, the sound of real emotion set to slow rhythms and warm arrangements. This wasn't background music, it was a soundtrack for late nights and quiet rooms. Each lyric carried weight. Each pause carried meaning. Welcome to My Room became a hidden treasure among radio DJs who specialized in what was then called the quiet storm, a style that blended R&B, romance, and emotional honesty. Randy Brown quickly became one of the era's most distinctive voices, even if he was never the loudest. Behind the scenes, he remained humble and soft-spoken. Musicians who worked with him said he was meticulous in the studio, never rushed, never careless. He would often record the same line several times, not because it was off-key, but because he wanted it to feel right. "You can't fake soul," he reportedly told one producer. "Either you mean it, or it means nothing." That philosophy defined his artistry. While others chased trends, Randy crafted songs that aged like good wine, growing deeper with time. His records didn't explode on the charts, but they lingered in the airwaves long after the hits faded. Listeners wrote letters to local DJs, requesting his songs late at night, calling them music for the heart, not the crowd. By the end of the decade, Randy Brown had quietly carved a space for himself, not in the mainstream, but in the memories of those who still valued sincerity. His journey was not about fame, it was about purpose. He once told a friend, "Maybe I'm not meant to be famous. Maybe I'm meant to be felt." Oh. That belief carried him into the next chapter, a period that would show both the beauty and the burden of staying true to yourself in a world that rewards imitation. For Randy Brown, success never arrived with noise or spectacle. It came softly, like a melody that stays long after the music ends. When Welcome to My Room began circulating through late-night radio shows, something rare happened. People didn't just listen, they remembered. The album didn't chart high, but it reached deep. DJs across the South, especially in Memphis and Chicago, started calling Randy's voice a secret weapon for slow jam sets. His songs weren't made for dance floors. They were meant for quiet moments when lights were low and hearts were open. Listeners found honesty in his phrasing. He didn't try to impress with range or power. Instead, he sang as if every lyric carried a truth he had lived through. Songs like Do You Love Me and Without You felt personal, like pages torn from a journal. Even his pauses spoke volumes. Silence became part of the rhythm, breathing between the notes. By the late part of 1977, Welcome to My Room had earned him respect among musicians and soul collectors. Critics began comparing him to legends like Bobby Womack and Johnny Taylor. not for imitation, but for sincerity. Randy wasn't trying to sound like anyone else, he was trying to sound real. What set him apart was his southern elegance, a gentleness that never diluted his strength. In a world moving toward synthesizers and disco glitter, he remained loyal to live instruments, to the texture of strings and brass. His music sounded human, imperfect, and alive. That authenticity became his trademark. Soon, Randy began working on follow-up projects, expanding his sound but never losing that emotional intimacy. Each new recording felt like a conversation, not a performance. Fans wrote letters to radio stations describing how his songs got them through heartbreak, loss, or long nights alone. In that connection, Randy had found his measure of success not in numbers, but in meaning. Yet, even in this period of recognition, he remained humble. Those close to him said he was happiest in the studio, headphones on, eyes closed, swaying to his own rhythm. He didn't just sing soul, one engineer recalled. He was soul. Idon. This was the turning point not because the world finally noticed, but because Randy Brown had discovered who he was as an artist. He no longer sang to prove himself. He sang to preserve something sacred in a fading era. While others were chasing hits, Randy was keeping the heart of soul alive. His success wasn't loud, but it was lasting. And in the world of real music, that kind of success is the rarest of all. By the time the late 1970s gave way to a new decade, Randy Brown had found his rhythm, a rhythm that didn't follow trends, but followed truth. His name began circulating among music lovers who still believed in melody and message. To them, Randy wasn't just another voice. He was a reminder of what soul once meant. The release of Intimately marked his arrival at artistic maturity. The production was smoother, the lyrics more reflective, and his voice deeper, wiser, more controlled. Tracks like I Was Blessed and I'm Here showed an artist who no longer needed to chase emotion. He had learned to let emotion come to him. Each song felt lived in, as though he had walked through every word before singing it. Fans called it grown man's soul, the kind of music that doesn't beg for attention but earns respect through honesty. When Randy sang about love, it wasn't fantasy. It was experience, the kind that comes with heartbreak, reconciliation, and quiet forgiveness. He gave romance a dignity it often lacked in popular music. As radio embraced the emerging quiet storm format, Randy's songs became essential to that movement. His voice fit perfectly between the smooth bass lines and lush strings, creating a mood that was sensual without ever being shallow. Late-night DJs used his music to bridge the gap between R&B and intimacy, describing it as the sound of midnight memories. He began touring small theaters and lounges, performing for audiences who didn't scream but listened. His stage presence was understated, almost spiritual. He'd stand behind the microphone, eyes half closed, and let the song breathe. You could feel the room holding its breath with him. Behind that calm exterior, though, Randy was meticulous. In rehearsals, he focused on phrasing, on tone, on the small details that made a performance feel effortless. Musicians admired him not just for his voice, but for his discipline, the quiet professionalism that separated the artists from the entertainers. By now, critics began to take notice. In independent magazines and radio columns, writers described him as a Southern gentleman of soul. They admired his ability to balance vulnerability with control, a trait that made his songs timeless. Even when he sang about heartbreak, there was grace in the way he delivered it. He could have leaned into commercial trends, added disco beats or pop hooks, but he never did. He knew who he was, and that authenticity was his greatest strength. In an era when image often overshadowed substance, Randy Brown stood out precisely because he didn't chase the spotlight. In Memphis, his hometown, he became something of a legend among musicians. Younger artists would seek him out for advice, and he always gave the same answer: make it real. If it ain't real, it won't last. That sentence summed up his philosophy, one that would echo through his work for decades. For Randy Brown, this was the golden moment not of fame, but of fulfillment. He had found his audience, his purpose, and his peace. The applause might have been quieter than that of bigger stars, but for those who understood, it meant more. And as the lights dimmed after every show, his voice lingered smooth, soulful, and unmistakably sincere. In those moments, Randy Brown didn't just sing soul music, he was soul music. The early 1980 brought a quiet shift, one that many soul singers could feel long before the headlines confirmed it. Record labels were changing. The airwaves were filled with drum machines, synthesizers, and glossy hooks. The new sound was brighter, faster, and more commercial. It had rhythm, but it had lost something deeper, the heartbeat. For artists like Randy Brown, who built their craft on warmth and emotion, the industry was becoming colder. His kind of music didn't fit neatly into the new molds. It wasn't made for dance floors or TV shows. It was made for people who still believed that a voice could tell the truth. But truth, in those years, was no longer profitable. After Intimately, Randy continued to record and perform, releasing albums that stayed loyal to his roots. The critics praised them, but the charts stayed silent. Major labels began investing in artists who could fill arenas, not those who could fill heart. The shift wasn't personal, it was cultural. But for Randy, it felt like the world was moving on without him. He had always measured success differently. Fame was never his goal. But as radio playlists tightened and soul stations disappeared, even the loyal ones found it harder to hear his voice. The decline wasn't sudden, it was slow, like a sunset that lasted years. Still, Randy refused to compromise. He turned down offers that asked him to chase pop trends or change his sound. To him, doing so would mean losing the very thing that made his music honest. "I can't pretend to be something I'm not," he reportedly said during one studio session. If that means less people listen, then so be it. It was that integrity, beautiful but costly, that became both his strength and his burden. While other artists adapted to survive, Randy stayed pure to his style, and purity doesn't always pay the bills. The crowds got smaller, the shows more intimate. Yet, on stage, he was the same man, calm, graceful, fully present. Friends and fellow musicians recalled those years as bittersweet. "He never complained," one said. "He'd just say, 'The music will find the people who need it.' And somehow, it did. His records began circulating among collectors, quietly passing from hand to hand, like sacred keepsakes of a fading era. But the changing times left a mark. By the mid-1980, soul had splintered into R&B, funk, and pop, each chasing its own version of modernity. Randy belonged to none of them, and in that way, belonged to all. He became a symbol of authenticity in an age of image. There was no single moment of downfall, no scandal, no headline, just silence. The kind of silence that can only follow a sound too honest for its time. For many, that silence felt like loss. But for Randy Brown, it was simply life, another verse in a song that never needed to end with applause. He continued recording into the years ahead, not for fame, but for faith in what music could still mean. And though the spotlight moved on, those who once heard him knew, the voice was still there, waiting, patient, untouched by fashion. By the time the spotlight had drifted away, Randy Brown was living in a world that no longer made space for his kind of soul. The industry had traded feeling for formula, and what once defined him, warmth, sincerity, vulnerability, now seemed out of fashion. Yet Randy never saw himself as outdated. To him, soul wasn't a trend, it was truth. The 1980 were a difficult decade for artists who had come of age in the era of live bands and analog studios. Synths replaced strings, and computers replaced conversation. The intimacy that Randy's music carried didn't fit the cold perfection of the new sound. Record labels grew cautious, preferring hits they could predict over hearts they could move. Randy tried to adapt in small ways, experimenting with production, collaborating with younger musicians, but he never lost sight of what made him unique. Still, the calls from record executives became fewer. The tours grew shorter. The silence between projects stretched longer. For a man who had once lived to sing, that silence was the hardest sound of all. He faced what many artists eventually face, the quiet ache of being overlooked. No scandals, no failures, just absence. The audiences who once filled small theaters moved on, and radio stations that once spun his records now played faster, shinier things. It wasn't rejection. It was indifference, and somehow, that hurt more. Friends said Randy handled it with grace. He never blamed anyone, never spoke bitterly of the changing times. He'd smile and say, Music's like life, it moves on, and so should we. But behind that calm exterior was a man who still longed for connection, for the feeling of standing on stage and knowing that someone out there understood. He began recording independently, releasing music for a smaller, loyal audience. These projects didn't chart, but they mattered to him and to the few who still listened. There was something deeply human about that period, a man making art not for applause, but for survival of the spirit. Randy Brown's crisis wasn't one of ego, it was one of faith. Could he still believe in the power of soul when the world no longer did? He answered that question every time he stepped into a studio, every time he sang a note that no one asked for but everyone needed. Some nights, he'd perform in small clubs across the South rooms where the stage was barely raised, where the audience could reach out and touch the sound. Those who were there say he sang better than ever. There was no pressure to impress, no industry eyes watching, just a man, a microphone, and the truth. For Randy, that was enough. He may have been forgotten by the mainstream, but he had found something purer, peace in his purpose. The world outside may have changed, but inside those songs, time stood still. The years that followed were quiet ones. For many, they might have felt like an ending, but for Randy Brown, they were something else, a continuation, just in a lower key. He never disappeared. He simply moved where the noise couldn't reach him. He kept recording through the 1990 and into the early 2000s, often financing his own sessions, sometimes performing for crowds small enough to remember each face. To him, every show mattered. Whether there were 50 people or 5, he gave the same energy, the same tenderness. Because what he offered wasn't entertainment, it was emotion. As the music industry shifted into the digital age, Randy's voice began to find an unexpected second life. Collectors and soul enthusiasts in places like Japan and the United Kingdom started hunting for his vinyl records, treating them like rare artifacts. His albums, once modestly pressed and quietly released, became prized possessions among those who still believed that music should be felt, not streamed. At home in America, small radio programs continued to play his songs during late-night hours. DJs spoke of him in reverent tones, calling him one of the last true soul men. They'd introduce his tracks with a sense of quiet pride, as if sharing a secret only the faithful could understand. And that was the paradox of Randy Brown's later years, forgotten by the masses, remembered by the devoted. The mainstream world had moved on, but in record shops and music circles that treasured authenticity, his name carried weight. Still, life wasn't easy. Without the support of major labels, Randy lived modestly. He worked with local musicians, mentored younger singers, and occasionally spoke about his experiences not with bitterness, but with acceptance. "Every era has its sound," he said once. "Mine just had more heart than volume." Even in decline, his dignity remained intact. There were no public outbursts, no desperate comebacks, just consistency, a man quietly creating, because that's what he was born to do. By the time the new millennium arrived, soul music was being rediscovered by a new generation. Some younger artists cited him as an influence, studying his phrasing, his patience, his emotional clarity. His music began to appear in playlists curated by collectors who refused to let those voices be lost to time. But fame never returned. And perhaps that was the point. Randy Brown's story wasn't meant to be a comeback. It was meant to be a reminder that even without spotlights, truth still shines. In those final decades, he embodied the soul of endurance. While others measured success in awards and recognition, Randy measured his in honesty. The man who once filled Memphis with his sound had learned that silence too can be a kind of music. And when he finally stepped away from the stage, he left behind something pure, not a brand, not a trend, but a feeling. The kind that lingers long after the last note fades, reminding those who still listen that authenticity never ages. Long after the applause had faded, Randy Brown's music continued to travel quietly, steadily, like a whisper carried on warm, southern air. In Memphis, his name became one of those passed down in conversations between true music lovers. To outsiders, he was a mystery. To insiders, he was a legend, the kind of artist whose influence wasn't announced, but felt. In America, his songs remained fixtures of late-night radio. DJs who specialized in quiet storm programming kept his records close at hand, slipping them between tracks by Luther Vandross and Marvin Gaye. They said Randy's voice filled the space between the notes, soft, sincere, unmistakably human. For listeners who stayed up late, his music became more than nostalgia. It was comfort. Collectors described his vinyl albums as treasures of a lost era, symbols of when music was made to be listened to, not just consumed. Each track, from I Was Blessed to Without You, carried the warmth of analog tape and the weight of lived experience. People would hold those records, feel their texture, and remember a time when sound had soul. Randy's reputation grew quietly through word of mouth. Music journalists rediscovered his catalog, praising the depth and restraint in his performances. They wrote about how his songs refused to age, how they still sounded fresh, even in a digital world obsessed with volume and speed. One critic put it best: Randy Brown didn't chase time, he captured it. Across the ocean, in places like Japan and the United Kingdom, his legacy found new life. Japanese collectors revered him, reissuing his albums on limited edition vinyl. British soul DJs played his tracks in underground clubs, where younger audiences born decades after his prime swayed to his sound with reverence. To them, Randy represented something sacred, the kind of authenticity that modern music rarely offered. Artists from both sides of the Atlantic began to sample his work, weaving snippets of his voice into new creations. It was as though the next generation had reached back through time to borrow his emotion, his phrasing, his soul. In interviews, they often spoke his name with gratitude, saying his music taught them what sincerity sounds like. And in that, Randy achieved what fame never could: longevity. His songs outlived the trends that once overshadowed them. His records, though few, remain timeless. Even in the streaming era, where millions of songs fight for seconds of attention, his catalog found a devoted audience that listens all the way through. In Memphis, younger singers spoke of him as a teacher without a classroom, a model of what it means to serve the music, not the market. They admired how he carried himself, graceful, humble, and true to the craft. He showed us you don't need a spotlight to shine, one local artist said at a tribute performance. Randy Brown's legacy wasn't loud, but it was luminous. It existed in the quiet corners of record stores, in the glow of late-night radios, and in the hearts of those who still believe that music should mean something. And that, perhaps, is the truest form of immortality, when a voice becomes a memory, and a memory becomes a home. When news broke on the 3rd of March 2025 that Randy Brown had passed away at 72, the headlines were few, but the tributes ran deep. He was not a household name, but to those who understood, the loss felt personal. Across Memphis, radio DJs interrupted their regular programming to play I Was Blessed. The song floated through the air like a prayer, soft and eternal, carrying the same tenderness that had defined his life. Social media filled quietly with messages from musicians, collectors, and longtime fans. They didn't post shock or gossip, only gratitude. He never needed the spotlight, one comment read. He was the light. Others shared stories of discovering his voice for the first time, how a song from decades ago had helped them through heartbreak, or how his calm tone felt like a conversation across time. In Japan, where his records had long been cherished, local soul clubs held tribute nights. DJs played his music on vinyl, respecting the crackle and warmth that digital sound could never replicate. In London, a small independent radio station dedicated an entire hour to his career, describing him as a man who kept the flame of soul alive when the world forgot to look. American newspapers wrote modest obituaries, but fans knew that the story couldn't be told in a few paragraphs. It lived in the spaces between his songs, in the gentle pauses, the restrained phrasing, the sense that every note came from truth. His music had never been about fame. It was about honesty. And honesty doesn't die. Younger soul singers began covering his songs, bringing his catalog to new audiences. Some even posted renditions on YouTube, their voices trembling with respect. It was as if a new generation had finally caught up to what Randy had always known, that real emotion doesn't age. In Memphis, a small gathering was held in his honor. It wasn't a grand event, just local musicians, friends, and fans sharing stories. Someone played a recording of Do You Love Me through an old speaker, and as the room fell silent, you could see people closing their eyes, letting the voice wash over them. It wasn't sadness they felt, it was recognition, the kind you feel when something true has passed through your life. For many, Randy's death became a reminder of how fragile art can be, how easily it can be overlooked, and how vital it is to remember. His passing reignited interest in his music. Record stores reported increased searches for his albums, and streaming numbers quietly rose. But those who knew him best believed his spirit was never gone. He lived in the songs, one musician said, and the songs don't stop. And oh, even in absence, Randy Brown remained present in every late-night broadcast, every dusty record shelf, every moment when a listener somewhere pressed play and felt something genuine. That is how legends live, not through noise, but through persistence, not through fame, but through feeling. And for those who still listen, Randy Brown's voice remains exactly as it always was, warm, honest, and alive. The record spins one last time. The room is quiet, and the only sound left is the soft hum of a voice that refuses to fade. You can almost see him there, eyes closed, one hand on the mic, the other steadying the rhythm in his heart. Randy Brown never needed fame to be remembered. His music was built for something deeper, for people who listen, not with their ears, but with their hearts. In every note he sang, there was grace. In every silence, truth. He gave the world honesty in a time when honesty was rare. Hollywood may have forgotten his name, but the soul community never did. Because legends like Randy don't need headlines. They live in memories. In every small club, in every midnight radio show, in every vinyl groove that still carries his warmth, his spirit is there, waiting for anyone willing to feel. He once said that music should make you believe in something, and that belief is what keeps his story alive today. Randy's songs still travel farther than fame ever could, across decades, across oceans, into hearts that never met him but somehow know him. When we listen to his voice now, we're not just hearing music. We're hearing the sound of endurance of an artist who stayed true when the world changed around him. He was proof that even in silence, meaning can sing. So maybe that's the real legacy. Not the records sold, not the awards missed, but the quiet impact that never left. The way a single song could make you stop and remember who you are. The way truth sounds when it's sung, not spoken. Do you remember the first time a voice stopped you in your tracks? The first time you felt a song instead of just hearing it? That's what Randy Brown gave us, the reminder that music can still feel human. If this story touched you, help keep that feeling alive. Leave a comment, share a memory, or play one of his songs tonight. Because remembering is how we honor those who gave us something real. And if you believe that some stars never truly fade, that they just shine where fewer eyes can see, then stay with us. Subscribe, and help us keep voices like Randy Brown's alive. Because in the end, it's not the fame that lasts, it's the feeling. And Randy Brown left us with plenty to feel.